All right, in our class so far in Texas history, we've seen that the Spanish arrived in the 1500s to explore what we now know as Texas. They ran into many different Indian groups that were living in what we now know as Texas. The Spanish claimed a large chunk of Texas, first Pineda exploring the coast, and then de Vaca sort of washing up near Galveston in his journey, and Coronado looking for the cities of gold, claiming the Panhandle. But eventually the Spanish authorities realized that Texas had no gold, or none they could find, and therefore they weren't too interested in Texas. They were interested in Central and South America because they had found gold and silver mines there to make Spain rich, but Texas, not so much. So the Spanish really didn't pay much attention to Texas until the La Salle expedition, the French expedition, which accidentally landed in Texas. And even though the expedition only lasted a couple of years in Texas and it was very unsuccessful, and most of the people there died except for a few kids, the Spanish were very worried that Europeans like the French might come in and take the land they claimed. And so the Spanish started building missions in East Texas to keep the French and others out in order to make transportation back to central Mexico a little bit easier from the Rio Grande. They found a halfway point to East Texas, and that halfway point was San Antonio, where they built missions. Of course, they also built some missions out in El Paso as well. So the interest in Texas supposedly was, of course, to Christianize the Indians, which the missions did. They did Christianize a few Indians, but in reality, the mission system is really designed to claim the land and to keep others out. Eventually, when New France was no more, the Spanish dismantled the mission system, at least the missions in East Texas, and ordered everybody back to San Antonio, although, of course, a few of those Spaniards stay and basically start Nacogdoches. At this point, of course, we look at the revolt in Mexico against Spanish rule, and we see how the Criollos want to, take over for the Peninsulares and become richer, and the Mestizos want to become richer, and basically everyone wants to become richer. Actually, the revolution starts out sort of as a poor person's revolution with the cry of Dolores from Father Hidalgo in 1810. But several years later, sort of the rich people of Mexico joined that revolution to overthrow the Spanish authorities here. Back in Spain, Spain had become more liberal, and the people in Mexico recognized that they were still somewhat conservative, and that by taking over and becoming independent, that not only would they no longer have to report back to a more liberal Spain, but that many sort of rich people in Mexico could become even richer. Although, of course, the poor Indians would still be somewhat poor. And so with especially the Plan of Iguala, which guaranteed that Mexicans of all levels would be treated equally in the law, and that Mexico would become a Catholic country, it would also become an independent country. In 1821, Mexico became an independent country with the Treaty of Cordoba. Having said that, Mexico was very interested in actually populating Tejas, Texas. They felt that if they didn't do that, that some other European power or the growing, expanding United States would come in and take it over. And so they encouraged settlement there. Fortunately for the Mexican government, just a year or two before Mexico took over, a guy named Moses Austin had asked the Spanish government if he could bring some Anglo settlers into Texas, and the Spanish government had said yes. And even though Moses Austin had died, his son Stephen F. Austin, comes into Texas and, of course, has to renegotiate the contract with the Mexicans, but he becomes one of the first impresarios that's leading American families into Texas. His families that he led at first, called the Old 300, the first 300 Anglo families in Texas, were, by Mexican standards, extremely wonderful people because they swore allegiance to Mexico. They became Roman Catholics. They learned Spanish. And then, of course, most of them became agricultural, and and started many farms, which helped increase the worth of Texas to the Mexican government. So the Mexican government was really happy with the old 300, so it started allowing more land grants from Stephen F. Austin and for others as well. Of course, a few of those land grants were actually for Mexicans who were coming up for the cattle industry. But over time, more and more Anglos came into Texas, but over time, less and less Anglos sort of measured up in Mexican eyes. That is, the old 300 had done everything the Mexican government wanted them to, but as other Texans, other Anglos came into Texas, they really didn't learn Spanish, they didn't convert to Roman Catholicism, and they really weren't too interested perhaps in becoming Mexican citizens. They just basically wanted the land, and they wanted to make their lives better and more productive and richer by using the land that was in Mexican Texas. Of course, as we saw, at least one of those Anglo impresarios, when they got land, they got land near Nacogdoches. Hayden Edwards, he did not actually follow through on his promise to make sure that the Spaniards, now Mexican people living in and around Nacogdoches, were taken care of, and the Mexican government sort of came down on the side of the people already living there against Hayden Edwards, at which point the Edwards sort of proclaimed this new land grant an independent republic, an independent country called the Republic of Fredonia. Now, the Republic of Fredonia, as you know, didn't last very long, thanks to Stephen F. Austin, and many people from his colony came along, and basically sort of a part-time army along with the Mexican army put down that rebellion very quickly in Fredonia, which ceased to exist. And of course, the ringleaders of that group, Hayden Edwards and others, fled to the United States. But still, the Mexican government became very suspicious of Anglos moving to Texas, even though Stephen F. Austin and other Texans gathered together and basically said, hey, look, we are very loyal to Mexico. Don't blame us for a few idiots. Around this time as well, in Mexico City, there's a dispute over who's going to run the Mexican government, who's going to take over and run the Mexican government under the Constitution of 1824. Ever since Mexico had been created, it's basically been a rich group of people called the Federalists, who basically wanted state government to be sort of strong and the national government not so strong. But then another group of rich people, the Centralists, they wanted the national government to be very strong and the states to have very little power. And the Centralists were basically taking over and promoting that centralized power. Texans became worried, although they heard that a nice guy named Santa Anna was trying to take over, and the Texans believed that he was a good Federalist and would help them out. Meanwhile, because of the Fredonian Revolt, as you know, the law of April 6th of 1830 was passed, which stopped immigration coming into Texas. And that, of course, again, sort of worried Texans who were already there. Meanwhile, there's some trouble at Anahuac, where some settlers had gotten in some battles, or at least fist fights, if not actual gunshot battles with some Mexican troops. Again, most Texans immediately said that we're loyal to Mexico. In the Turtle Bayou Resolution, the Convention of 1832 and 1833, Texans reinforced that idea that Texans were loyal to Mexico. There was no need to send the Mexican army into Texas. And as we know, the Texans who met in the Convention of 1833 also sent Stephen F. Austin to see the new Mexican president, Santa Anna, to ask him to allow more immigration, to allow more Anglo immigration in Texas, basically to do away with the taxes that the Mexican government had imposed, and basically to even make Mexico its own state. Now, as we know, Stephen F. Austin did to see Santa Anna. He did see at least some government officials, and they assured him that Santa Anna would probably act favorably on all these things. And then, of course, on his way back to Texas, Stephen F. Austin was arrested and charged with treason and sent back to Mexico, and he was there in prison in chains. when eventually Santa Anna arrives. And Santa Anna did say that he was taking interest in Texas, and that he wanted to reform Texas, and that he would allow Anglos to continue to immigrate to Texas, and that sadly, of course, Texas would not be its own Mexican state yet, but it'd still be attached to Coahuila for a while. But still, Texans were still somewhat happy to hear that Santa Anna was, at least allowing more immigration to Texas from the United States. Nevertheless, there was still some concern, especially after another little incident at Anahuac. And again, Texans sort of joined together in a convention and agreed to meet. And but Texans had sort of been divided at this point. Some basically didn't even want to meet. They thought that this meeting might anger Santa Anna, it might anger the Mexican government, and that they wanted to assure the Mexican government that they were very loyal to Mexico. Others, what's called the War Party, wanted to hold the meeting and wanted to send a message to Mexico City that Texans were even willing to fight for their rights if it came down to that. Even though they didn't want a war, Texans, believed that they might be being mistreated unfairly by the Mexican government. Just about the time the meeting was about to begin, Stephen F. Austin finally arrives back from Mexico City after he's been released by Santa Anna. He's been gone 2.5 years, a large part of that in jail. Stephen F. Austin had at one time been a very vocal supporter for Mexico. He had been very thankful the Mexican government had given him land grants. He had been very thankful and happy to be a Mexican impresario and bring Anglos settlers to Texas. But when he was in Mexico, he saw that the new Mexican government headed by Santa Anna was not going to be the type of government Texans wanted. Santa Anna, in Stephen F. Austin's eyes, was probably going to become a dictator and probably going to be taking rights away from Texas. So when Stephen F. Austin gets back to Texas, he sort of sides with the War Party and in this consultation meeting, and wants that meeting to go forward. Meanwhile, more troops were arriving from Mexico. The Mexican army arrived in Texas. That's because tensions had continued to develop between the Mexican government and people in Texas. General Cos, which is Santa Anna's brother-in-law, arrives in Texas and brings the total of number of Mexican troops in Texas to over 600, which actually does not sound like very much, because by this time there's probably 20 to 25,000 non-Indians in Texas, most of them Anglos in Texas. But nevertheless, was a concern for many Texans because it seemed like, of course, with this number of troops increasing, this might be bad news for people that wanted Texas freedom and liberties and rights to be honored by the Mexican government. And rumors started to spread very quickly that General Cos was going to arrest all the disloyal leaders, especially some of those leaders at Anahuac, like William Travis and some others, and he was going to march them back to Mexico in chains and probably execute them there. And of course, this really angered Texans, because Texans believed that if you did something wrong, and you should be arrested by civil authorities, and you'd have a trial by jury from your local peers, that there would not be military trials, that you would not be thrown in a prison by military personnel, but that you'd be tried by your local citizens. And if found guilty, you might spend time in a local jail, but certainly not anything the military would do. So in Texas, in different Texas colonies and different Texas towns, groups started to form to share political and military information. They were called committees of correspondence. Correspondence basically meant letter writings. And in some ways, they were modeled after American Revolutionary War committees of correspondence, because many of these Anglos, of course, had moved from the United States of America, and so they knew U.S. history. And harkening back to the American Revolutionary War, the British colonists here in the Americas had proclaimed their loyalty to Britain, but then Britain had sent over troops, and things had gotten out of hand. And during that time period in the 1770s, British Americans had organized into committees of correspondence, and now that's what Texans were doing. They were organizing into committees of correspondence, basically to keep everybody in Texas informed about what was happening. Now, when those troops arrived, those Mexican troops arrived in San Antonio, one of the first things they did was they were concerned with disarming any Texas militia. The Texas militia, these were part-time soldiers that basically, were civilians, and they only became an army when there was a reason to become an army, like when the Indians were attacking, and that's why Texas militias had started in the first place, was to protect their local towns against Indians. These local militias usually, of course, at the time kept their weapons at home with them, their muskets. Of course, muskets were good for hunting as well, animals. So most men in Texas had a musket. Most households had at least one musket in Texas. And they had a store of gunpowder. Of course, back then, your gunpowder was separate from your bullet, and you had to load your weapon with gunpowder and then put your musket ball down and fire it off. And some militias even had cannons to defend themselves in their towns against Indians. But now the Mexican government was concerned that some of these Texas militia might use their arms and ammunition against the Mexican government. Especially General Cos in San Antonio heard that the people of Gonzales had a cannon that had been loaned to them to use against the Indians. And so General Cos sent out some of his troops down to Gonzales to retrieve the cannons. Now, when the troops got there, the local townspeople refused to give back the cannon. And instead, they basically flew a flag that said, "Come and take it." And this sort of rebellion against Mexican authority reminded some Anglos in Texas about how the British troops in the 1770s had tried to take away arms and ammunition from the British colonists in America, and that had led to a battle in Lexington, Massachusetts, which set off the American Revolutionary War. So now Anglos will start calling this incident in Gonzales, they'll start calling Gonzales the Lexington of Texas, believing that this would be setting off a sort of a revolutionary war here, just like the Lexington in Massachusetts started off the American Revolutionary War. So as you can see, the town of Gonzales, the townspeople refused to give off the cannons, and in fact actually shot at the Mexican troopers. Again, after being ordered to surrender their cannons, the townspeople did not. They got together. They eventually had that nice little flag saying, "Come and take it." I like the fact the white flag, was made from a wedding dress. So the battle itself was rather short. Now, the cannon itself was not very useful in the battle. But first of all, the Mexican soldiers that had come out to take the cannon hadn't come out for a war. They weren't prepared for a war. They hadn't brought extra ammunition. So when the townsfolk start shooting at them, basically the Mexican troopers start retreating back to San Antonio. As you can see on the map there, from Gonzales back to the town of San Antonio, where the main Mexican army was. Just a few days later, down at Goliad, there had been another short battle, and when those people had heard about the Lexington of Texas, when those people at Goliad had heard about the Battle of Gonzales, they quickly went to Goliad and demanded the little fort there with some Mexican soldiers surrendered, and they threatened to kill those Mexican soldiers if they didn't leave the fort. So those Mexican troopers also retreated from the fort at Goliad as well. So on to San Antonio. So on October 9th, again, a few days after what happened at Gonzales, Texas forces took control at the garrison at Goliad. And that small group of Mexican soldiers sort of started retreating back towards the border of Texas, back towards even the Rio Grande River, basically to get away from these colonists who now had weapons. The battles of Gonzales and Goliad convinced many Texans that the Mexican army could be defeated easily. After all, really, both battles lasted less than 30 minutes, and both battles, both at Goliad and Gonzales, ended up with the Mexican army retreating quickly and leaving the scene. So many Texans said, "Oh, I'm sure if we go to San Antonio, that army, the Mexican army there with 600 guys, they'll run away too." The only Mexican army left in Texas was that group of soldiers in San Antonio, commanded by the brother-in-law of Santa Anna, General Cos. So on to San Antonio they went. They quickly called their army the Army of the People of Texas as they marched to San Antonio. Unfortunately, the Army of the People of Texas, that is the Texas militia, the Texas volunteers, didn't have any large cannons, which means when they got to San Antonio, it's not like they could basically blast the Spanish army out of the town of San Antonio. Instead, they would basically have to surround the town and try to starve the Mexican army out. Meanwhile, as these skirmishes were going on, as the war gets started, delegates from around Texas meet to decide what to do. 58 delegates attend. They're basically divided into two groups. The war party, who opposes Santa Anna, just like the peace party does, wants an immediate declaration of independence from Mexico. That is, they want Texas to be a separate nation. But many Texans still are loyal to Mexico. Even though the peace party, even though those Texans don't like Santa Anna either, they simply want to be their own Mexican state under the Constitution of 1824. So by this time, with the skirmishes at Gonzales and at Goliad, Texans are sort of split. Again, they're united in the fact they don't like Santa Anna, but one group actually simply wants to have Texas as an independent country, but most Texans still prefer to have Texas as a Mexican state under the Constitution of 1824, the Federalist Constitution, which guaranteed states' rights in Mexico. So in this meeting they hold, the consultation voted not to declare independence from Mexico. That is, we're loyal Mexican citizens. We just don't like these centralists in power. We just don't like Santa Anna and what he's doing and try to take away our state's rights. They adopted a statement known as the Declaration of the People. After all, it was the Army of the People, so why not the Declaration of the People? In this declaration, they basically pledged support for the Mexican Constitution of 1824. Again, we're loyal Mexicans. We're loyal to Mexico. And basically, we just want to be our own Mexican state. And again, the only reason we actually attacked these Mexican troops in the first place was because mean old Santa Anna, the centralists, had seized power and were taking away our liberties. And of course, one of our liberties is the right to defend ourselves with cannons and guns. Meanwhile, this group also created a provisional, a temporary government to sort of rule in the place until Santa Anna was defeated. The government was going to be made up of governor, lieutenant governor, and a general council. That is a group of people with one representative from each district or town, so to speak. So the governor would be Henry Smith. And again, this was just temporary. This was temporary until Santa Anna was defeated and the Constitution of 1824 in Mexico was restored. And under this provisional government, they would create a regular army, sort of a full-time army. Up until this time, the battles have been fought by militia troops, that is, local volunteers that sort of volunteered to fight and would go back to being farmers when the battle was over. But the Texans recognized that driving out General Cos and basically protecting ourselves against the centralists in Santa Anna might take a larger, more professional group. And so they decided to create sort of a regular full-time army. And Sam Houston would be the leader of the regular army. The volunteers would still be volunteers and basically wouldn't be under his command. But while the volunteers were fighting, the new army under Sam Houston would be training and getting ready to fight in case they were needed. Meanwhile, around San Antonio, one of the scouts, one of the Texian militia men, had sort of gone far away from San Antonio, looking to see if the Mexican government was receiving any reinforcements. That is, if there were more Mexican troops on their way. His name, Death Smith, as he was called, he rode back into one of the camps near San Antonio, where, of course, the Texians had sort of surrounded San Antonio, hoping to starve General Coss out, and reported that a mule train, that is, a lot of mules with some Mexican cavalry, was headed to San Antonio. And many people in Texas, many people around San Antonio in Texas, they believed the mules were carrying silver to pay General Coss's army. That is, they believed, all these mules that had saddlebags, the saddlebags were basically full of money, were full of silver and gold coins. And so naturally, you don't want that silver and gold coins getting to your enemy. Who better to take it well than you? The volunteers who are fighting for freedom. And after all, when you're fighting for freedom, you might as well fight for freedom for a price. That is, you might as well get paid for that. And so the volunteers, the militia, the Texan militia decides to attack this mule train that's guarded by the Mexican cavalry troops. They did attack the mule train. The Mexican cavalry rode off. Basically, there wasn't much fighting, and pretty quickly the Texans discovered why there wasn't much fighting, because the silver train, the mule train with the packs full of silver weren't full of silver. They were full of grass that were going to San Antonio to feed Mexican horses. So it's called the grass fight because the Texans scored a tremendous victory and captured grass. So sometimes war is tough. Sometimes it's not quite like you plan it. But meanwhile, of course, the Mexican army, the government army, is still trapped in San Antonio, surrounded by volunteers. Oh, the Battle of San Antonio. So after the grass fight, many of these Texas volunteers, under the command of Ben Milam, realized that maybe the Mexican army wasn't as tough as people have been led to believe. And then also at one point in San Antonio, General Coss had started some fires, not to burn the town down, but the Texans who were on the hills overlooking San Antonio, to them, it sort of looked like maybe General Coss was trying to burn up the town. And so at that point, Ben Milam, turned and shouted, "Hey, who'll follow old Ben Milam into San Antonio?" And of course, his troopers said, "Hey, we'll follow you." And so Ben Milam marched his Texas volunteers into San Antonio. The fight in San Antonio lasted 4 days. The Texans basically advanced house to house in San Antonio. The Mexican army was basically driven from their first defensive lines into the secondary defensive lines, and basically into a mission called the Alamo. And the Mexican army was running out of supplies. Not only were they running out of food, but now that they were actually shooting at the Texans, they were also running out of ammunition. So on December 9th, Coss asked for the terms of surrender, and basically the terms of surrender was basically, General Coss, just get your army out of Texas. Leave. Goodbye. And don't come back. So with the other small group of Mexican troops that had retreated from Goliad and had left Texas already, General Coss's army that's now leaving, that means basically there are no more Mexican troops on Texas soil. So the Battle of San Antonio was seen as a great victory by Texans. But as the battle was over, some Texans were very happy and think, well, we've defeated Santa Anna, he won't be back. Others were saying, well, maybe Santa Anna will be back, maybe we should prepare. And again, there was sort of a division among Texans. And so in Texas, of course, besides the Anglos, there were other groups of people in Texas, including the Tejanos, the people of Mexican descent. Most of them simply wanted to stay neutral. Of course, many Mexicans many Texans of Mexican descent, they liked the Constitution of 1824 as well. But you never could tell who's going to win the battle in Mexico City. You never could tell who's going to be your new president of Mexico. And so if you're a Tejano here in Texas and you go, yes, we'll fight for the Constitution of 1824 and restore the old Mexican government, and Santa Anna wins, then when Santa Anna gets to Texas, you're going to be seen as a traitor and probably shot and killed. On the other hand, if you're a Tejano and say, oh, Santa Anna's my guy, yay! And if Santa Anna's defeated, then the Mexican forces, when they get to Texas, will find you and shoot and kill you. So many Tejanos just simply wanted to stay out of the fighting. They simply wanted to go about their lives and, maybe see which way the wind blew, so to speak. Some of those Tejanos did, however, join the fight to free Texas, at least from Santa Anna, and they were under the command of a guy named Juan Seguin. Seguin himself was born in San Antonio. He was against Santa Anna's violation of the Constitution of 1824. And again, probably there was no poll at the time. There's no one going door to door asking people their opinions. And probably if there had been, many Tejanos probably wouldn't have given them to you. But probably, if I had to guess, I'd probably say most Tejanos were probably, wanted the Constitution of 1824. They probably wanted a federal government. But again, many of them simply didn't want to take sides because there was some risk involved in doing that. Now, the African Americans in Texas, most of the African Americans had been brought in as slaves. There was a few free African Americans, but very few would actually fight for the Texas cause. Although, interesting enough, at the Battle of Goliad, the first Texian that was actually shot and wounded at that battle had been a slave. They had been freed, and so by the time the Battle of Goliad happened, they were a former slave, but nevertheless, so there were some free African Americans in Texas, although most of them were slaves. So, of course, if you're a slave, you probably don't want to fight for the wonderful Anglos in Texas, because they're sort of for slavery, and you know that the Mexican government's probably more or less against slavery. And you're probably figuring that if this revolution is put down by the Mexican government, maybe you might even get your freedom. Although if the Anglos win, you're probably going to be a slave for a long time. So even though the Mexican government had outlawed slavery in Mexico proper, and they had sort of turned a blind eye in Texas, again, because Mexico wanted Texas to be built up very quickly so that no other European power, the United States, would take over Texas. So even though they sort of turned a blind eye to slavery, I'm sure many slaves in Texas probably thought to themselves, well, if these Anglos lose and the Mexican government comes in, they'll probably make it just like Mexico and no more slavery and we'll be free. So, why risk your life for these Anglos who've enslaved you when you might actually have to fight and die as a slave? And even if the Anglos win and you help them, they might keep you as a slave anyway. So probably the best bet if you're a slave is simply to mind your own business and hope the new Mexican government wins and declares slavery is outlawed in Texas and that you're free. So most African Americans were not willing to fight to be, in a slave-owning country. Nevertheless, even though the Mexican army had left, General Cos had left Texas, General Cos and his army and a lot of reinforcements would be back under his brother-in-law, Santa Anna. So when Santa Anna hears what has happened in Texas, he raises up an army and starts marching towards Texas. In late 1835, with rumors flying everywhere, Texas basically says that we're going to hold a meeting in March of 1836 to discuss what to do. We'll see if Santa Anna has actually arrived. We'll see what's happening in 1836. But again, many Texans are divided whether to stay as loyal to Mexico and as a Mexican state or declare independence for an independent Texas. And so now they're going to hold another meeting to see what might happen. However, in January of 1836, Santa Anna marches towards Texas with a huge army. And in February, Santa Anna arrives in San Antonio with that huge army. The Texans still in San Antonio begin to move into the mission called the Alamo, and now start trying to make it strong enough to defend it. Meanwhile, in other parts of Texas, as Santa Anna marches towards San Antonio, marches in San Antonio, and arrives in San Antonio, and the people, the Texas volunteers have sort of barricaded themselves in the Alamo. Meanwhile, the convention of 1836 starts in March of 1836. The delegates meet Washington on the Brazos, which is just up the Brazos River from San Felipe de Austin. They elect a chairman, and they appoint someone to write a Declaration of Independence, George Childress. So now with Santa Anna's army in San Antonio, the largest city in Tejas, in Texas, and with Santa Anna's proclamation that he's going to put down this rebellion by force, and his intention is basically to run the Anglos out of Texas, Texans start to think about declaring their independence from Mexico. And George Childress is appointed to write this Declaration of Independence, if Texans vote for it. This declaration was modeled after the United States Declaration of Independence. That is, it lists some grievances they had against Santa Anna. This is why we're rebelling. This is why we're fighting against the Mexican government. And then they go ahead and list some of the things they said Santa Anna had done wrong. On March 2nd, the delegates approved independence for Texas and adopted the Texas Declaration of Independence. After adopting the Declaration of Independence, the delegates then begin to write a constitution for Texas. That is, how are we going to govern ourselves? If we are to become independent, what type of government should we have? Now, of course, since many of these people were from the United States, it was just obviously natural they should think that, well, we'll have a government like the United States. So the Texas Constitution is very similar to the United States Constitution. They both include 3 branches of government: an executive branch to enforce the laws, a legislative branch to make the laws, and a judicial branch to interpret and tell you what the laws mean. The legislative branch will be composed of 2 groups of people: an upper house and a lower house, to be elected by the voters of Texas, much like the U.S. Constitution. Also, this Texas Constitution will include a Bill of Rights, just like the U.S. Constitution, which guaranteed basic freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of trial by jury, which of course rules out that military trial that General Koss wants to give you. Now, some of the Texas Constitution, because of our Spanish background, because of our Mexican Spanish background, some of it actually is from that era as well. So a large part of the Texas Constitution almost reads almost like word for word from the U.S. Constitution, but there are parts that go back even further to our Spanish and Mexican heritage. So, for example, husband and wives jointly owning property. That's nowhere in the U.S. Constitution, but it's in the Texas Constitution because that was our Spanish and Mexican heritage. Also, slavery was made legal in Texas under the Texas Constitution of 1836. Now that you have this Constitution, now that you have a form of government, who are going to be your leaders? Well, first of all, under the Constitution, people are supposed to elect the leaders. They're supposed to elect the members of the legislative branch, and they're supposed to elect the executive or the president of Texas. But there's no time to hold elections because Santa Anna troops are in Texas. There's no time to hold elections. So instead, the people at this convention of 1836, they basically create and basically select their own government officials for a while until we can hold elections, what's called an ad interim government. So they created an ad interim government and made David G. Burnett as the ad interim president. That means he's president just for a while until we can hold elections. And Lorenzo de Zavala, who's a Tejano, as an ad interim vice president. Sam Houston was made commander of both the regular and volunteer army. Of course, remember, before he had been made commander of the regular army and the volunteers were still on their own. This time, Sam Houston is commander of the regular army, but now that basically also includes the volunteers, the militia units that are fighting already around San Antonio, and the militia units that are in San Antonio, in the Alamo, and other militia units in Texas. All that's going to be combined under Sam Houston's command.